Hello and welcome. I'm Leigh-Ann Gerrans and you're watching W News, broadcasting live from the Arabiya headquarters. These are our top stories. US President Donald Trump is speaking with Russian President Vladimir Putin in a call aimed at ending what he's described as the bloodbath in Ukraine. Former US President Joe Biden has been diagnosed with prostate cancer that has spread to his bones. Israel has announced it will allow a limited amount of food into Gaza as its ground offensive intensifies. US President Donald Trump is speaking with Russian President Vladimir Putin in a call aimed at ending what he's described as a bloodbath in Ukraine. After that, he's set to speak with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy, along with leaders from several NATO countries. For more on this, I'm joined from London by journalist Donna Lewis. Donna is a TV correspondent who was based in Russia for 12 years and one of the first Western journalists to ever interview President Putin. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. It's great to have you on the show. Trump has made ending the Russia-Ukraine war one of his most important foreign policy priorities since entering office. How high stakes is this call for Trump and his administration?
Well, I don't think it's politically high stakes for Trump. I mean, he already is way beyond what he said during the political campaign where he would end the war in 24 to 48 hours. I mean, we're months beyond that. So I guess we're really at a pivotal moment, though, in the sense that the Trump administration, whether it be led by his Secretary of State, or whether his Rubio or his Vice President J.D. Vance, or whether it be Trump himself or his negotiator, Witkoff, they're simply kind of reaching their wits' end in terms of trying to get the fighting stopped, trying to get Russia to agree to a 30-day ceasefire, which Ukraine agreed to. And they kind of feel like this is one of the last diplomatic moves for America to have a long one-on-one conversation with Trump, where Trump believes that his sort of personality and charisma may somehow convince President Putin to stop the shooting. Many people are pretty dubious of that notion, but it's an important call because President Putin's going to have to say yes or no, or give some kind of sign to the Americans that he's sincere himself when he says that Russia wants to end the war.
From your experience interviewing Putin and covering the Kremlin, what's your sense of how he's likely to respond to this kind of direct pressure from the US President Donald Trump?
Well, I would say it's interesting, first of all, the way that this unfolded in terms of diplomatic theater today, because President Trump was supposed to talk to President Putin and then brief Ukrainian President leader Zelenskyy afterwards. And in fact, we know now that, according to the White House, that Trump spoke to Zelenskyy first, and then he got on the phone with President Putin, and they've been on there for more than an hour. We don't know the exact minute the call started. But I think when you look at President Putin, he's just very good at stringing Trump along, stringing the Americans along and saying, yes, he wants to end the war, but he won't end the war because the longer the fighting goes on the ground, the more the Russians are able to take territory in those four regions. And they believe that maybe towards the end of this year, the Ukrainian lines could collapse. And they'll completely occupy the four regions that they have publicly announced that they want to annex, Kherson, Lugansk, Donetsk, and Zaporizhia. And then they'll have what they want anyway. So I think that they want to go on fighting, but they don't want to anger the American administration, which has talked about more possible sanctions, stronger sanctions. And so, Putin will flatter Trump and appear not to say no to President Trump. But that's exactly what he's doing. He is saying no, and he's continuing to fight, and he's not very sincere in terms of ending the war. Or if he is sincere in wanting to end the war, his conditions are so harsh that Ukraine simply will not meet those conditions.
And do you think that you said Ukraine might not meet those conditions, or certainly won't meet those conditions that Vladimir Putin is putting on the table? Do you think we could see the US pressuring Ukraine to accept those red lines from Russia to end what Donald Trump is calling the bloodbath in Ukraine?
You know, compromise is one thing, capitulation is another. And Ukraine is not prepared to completely do away with its armed forces now. It will never trust Russia in a peace agreement, or go through full demilitarization, or agree to a much smaller force. Maybe they'll shelve plans to join NATO. It's possible that Zelenskyy will have to let the Russians have 20% of Ukraine under American pressure. It's possible that Ukraine may agree to international recognition of Putin's invasion of the Crimea and illegal annexation there. But they're not going to surrender after all of this. And I don't think Zelenskyy has the power to tell Ukrainians he would do that anyway. So there are all sorts of problems in the negotiations. And even Russia's put forward another major demand, and that is that Ukraine give up demands for reconstruction of Ukraine paid for by Russia, and that could amount to trillions of dollars.
Trump and others, notably J.D. Vance, have said they will walk away from ceasefire talks if either side aren't willing to compromise. We've heard this time and time again. But will this be seen as a defeat for Donald Trump, who is, given so much to trying to end this war between Russia and Ukraine?
Yeah. I mean, it's a good question, Leigh-Ann, because I think that Trump is already positioning himself to say that this wasn't his war, that this was Biden's war, and that therefore he's not responsible for it. And therefore any failure, the implication is that any failure on his part to get the guns to stop firing there is not his problem, or wasn't his defeat there. So he's already kind of laying the groundwork for walking away from these negotiations. It's interesting also that, in connection with your question, that Vice President J.D. Vance said yesterday that Putin doesn't know how to get out of the war, quote unquote. That he doesn't know how to get out of the war. I mean, that's a very interesting take by the Trump White House, that Putin really wants out of the war and he doesn't know how to get out of it. I mean, a lot of people, especially European leaders, would say that Putin doesn't want an end to the war. It's not that he doesn't know how to end the war.
Yes, and we also heard J.D. Vance speaking today once again when he was just coming back from Rome, because we know he was at the Pope's inauguration and Zelenskyy was also there, and they held a meeting. So we are seeing things happening on the sidelines, if you want to put it that way.
Well, I mean, it's certainly an interesting meeting where you see Zelenskyy and J.D. Vance sitting around with other European leaders and smiling at one another after that blowout in the White House 2 months ago, where they basically were throwing Zelenskyy out of the White House. So, yeah, I think they've paved the road back. That is seen as something positive for Ukraine. And the fact that Zelenskyy was the first leader that Trump talked to before his call with Putin today, that is also seen as a positive, that Trump, who has swayed back and forth. I mean, one moment supporting Ukraine, another time, supporting President Putin. There's the belief that maybe he is listening to Ukraine more and is more willing to take into consideration Ukraine's position as a sovereign country and a country that was attacked and is only defending itself.
I just want to go back to sanctions, because you did mention it earlier. The US has previously threatened bone-crushing sanctions on Russia. So has the EU, if we have a look at things. And as you mentioned, is this the only way, do you think, possible to pressure Putin into peace or into a ceasefire?
I mean, that's a key word, pressure, right? I mean, what's the leverage on Putin if he really is not sincere in stopping the war? If he wants to take more of Ukraine, if he wants to go further in Europe into the Baltics and Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, possibly attack Poland, to reestablish Russia as an empire, as he's talked about it, like Peter the Great. I mean, what is the leverage that America or anybody else in Europe has to stop Putin in his tracks? So, lifting sanctions and promising some kind of economic prosperity, that hasn't worked so far. Bringing in more sanctions that would be punishing to Russia, but also to any country that allows the smuggling of goods to Russia, which takes place on a very large scale from Central Asia through China, other countries that buy oil from Russia. So those leverage would punish other countries as well. And I guess really the main leverage that everybody has campaigned for, except the Trump White House, and that is supply Ukraine the weapons to defend itself and stop Russia, give them what they need on the battlefield to stop the advance of Russian forces and maybe push Russian forces back. But Trump decided early on that he wasn't going to follow the same path that President Biden did, and he's largely stopped those weapon shipments, and that's going to affect the front lines of Ukraine as the months roll on in 2025, and Ukraine is in a very serious position because of it. But yes, sanctions are probably the one thing that Trump might levy, unless he's just going to totally withdraw from these talks. And so, what is Putin offering him on the call right now? It'll be very interesting to know what Putin offers in terms of ongoing dialogue and painting some kind of picture where he tries to convince Trump that he's sincere in talking and ending the fighting. I mean, what's he going to promise the Americans?
Well, we still haven't had any clarification that call has ended. So it's actually fairly long call, Dana Lewis. I'm not sure what you think of the fact that it is going on for a little while.
Well, I think that they've known to talk quite long in the past, and I think their last phone call took 2 hours. So that would give us at least another 30 minutes of President Trump talking to Putin. These are not generally video calls, they're audio calls with translation, which takes a long time because President Putin can speak English. But when it comes to negotiations, then he talks, because they're technical, he'll speak Russian and there'll have to be translation. So they take a long time. I think maybe the fact that they go on a long time is a good sign that they have something to talk about. And there are some issues that Trump feels that he can make some kind of headway on with President Putin. But let's see. I mean, so far, these long conversations, and it's been reported that Trump has held many conversations, even unofficially, with President Putin that have not been released by the White House. But as the talks go on, then you would hope that they make some kind of progress. And but these long discussions so far haven't brought us anywhere.
Journalist Dana Lewis, thank you so much for joining me. It was great to speak to you and get your insights.
Good to talk to you.
Thank you. Now, a win-win. That's how Prime Minister Keir Starmer is describing a major new deal between the UK and the EU. The agreement covers everything from food and defence to fishing and even travel. President of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, said the agreement opens a new chapter in the UK-EU relationship. Let's take a listen at what they both had to say shortly after unveiling the agreement.
We're turning a page. We're opening a new chapter in our unique relationship. This is the story of historical and natural partners standing side by side on the global stage, facing most of the same challenges, pursuing the same objectives, like-minded, sharing the same values, and thus we are looking for solutions that are beneficial for both our people and standing shoulder by shoulder when it comes to really getting to the solutions.
This is the first UK-EU summit. It marks a new era in our relationship. And this deal is a win-win. It delivers what the British public voted for last year. It gives us unprecedented access to the EU market, the best of any country outside of the EU or EFTA, all while sticking to the red lines in our manifesto about not rejoining the single market, the customs union, and no return to freedom of movement.
For more on this, I'm joined by Arabiya senior correspondent Karina Camel. Karina, great to have you on your show. I was stalking your social media a little bit today, and on it, you described today as deja vu. How did this deal come together, and why now?
Absolutely. For those of us covering the Brexit developments, the pre-Brexit, the actual vote in 2016, the exit in 2020, it does feel like a little bit of deja vu today. We're talking about the UK-EU divorce. And the question is, are we now talking about a marriage of convenience? What does today signify? We heard the warm words from both sides. Prime Minister Keir Starmer, European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen, European Council President Antonio Costas, all of them welcoming the deal, talking about a new era, talking about turning the page on the relationship. And that was really the intention, because this summit is very significant and historic. It's the first summit since the UK voted to leave the EU in 2016. It's the first summit since the United Kingdom left the European Union, and it almost didn't happen. We understand that negotiations actually went down to the wire, and what was agreed today was only agreed in the very early hours of this morning. And if you ask me why now, why is this deal happening now? There is a defense and security imperative. The global situation, the geopolitical landscape is such that the United Kingdom and the EU have the motivation, shall we say, to come together and try to iron out all those differences that have been hanging really since even before Britain voted to leave the European Union. So perhaps that was really the impetus to sit down and try to put the differences aside and focus on the big strategic issues where they can both agree and perhaps, shall we say, tackle the common enemies or the common challenges together. And the reason I said that it really did feel like deja vu, and I think this is a sentiment felt by many people who've covered this topic as a journalist, as analysts, as political commentators, is because the issues that we've been talking about today, the issues agreed upon and perhaps a path forward also, because not everything was finalized today, but the path forward on a lot of the issues today are the same issues that the two sides have been discussing for about a decade.
And the same issues, Karina, we've both been covering since that Brexit vote happened. But let's move on to the fishing part of the deal. It's getting really mixed reactions, particularly with EU access to UK fishing waters being extended to 2038. I remember there's been a big issue when we wanted to Brexit. Can you explain why?
Absolutely. And you know, for viewers who are across the Arab world or across our global audience who may not be familiar with the intricacies of what motivates European Union nations and the United Kingdom, they might be wondering, why is everybody talking about fishing? Why are fisheries so important? And it is really interesting because if you look at how much does the fishing industry contribute to UK GDP, it is minimal, 0.04% of GDP. That's what fisheries represent. In terms of the European Union GDP, that's the total of economic output. It's not 0.1%. So it's very minor on both sides. Why is it such a big deal? Why is it such a divisive political issue? The reason is because it is very concentrated in certain regions and certain countries. So for example, if we look at it from the EU side, Spain, for example, represents 15% of jobs in all of EU fishing. So for Spain, fishing is really important. In France, also a leading country, and by the way, France has taken a very hardline position and always has in most of the Brexit talks, as well as these particular agreements. France relies on fishing, but certain regions in France specifically rely on those fishing jobs, and those are particularly the regions where there is perhaps we can see a rise of Le Rassemblement National. The far-right parties are gaining a foothold in some of those regions. So the current French government, Emmanuel Macron, does not want to appear to have conceded to the United Kingdom in a politically sensitive region where the opposition could use it against him. Same thing for the United Kingdom. If you look at it from the other side, Scotland represents 70% of total United Kingdom fishing. So if Scotland feels like, for example, London, Westminster is throwing it under a bus, it might rethink having its own independence referendum from Westminster, from London, and that could reignite all those issues and all those divisions. And the same thing for the current Labour government. If you look at the regions within Great Britain, within England, that rely on fishing, we're talking about places like Grimsby, like Hull, like Plymouth. Again, these are areas where we are seeing the rise of reform. The sort of further right parties and the Conservatives pose a real challenge to Labour. So the Labour government does not want to appear to have conceded greatly on that issue. I suppose the problem for Labour is the main headline coming out of the summit today is this major concession that Keir Starmer has offered the European Union. What has been agreed? Britain has today agreed to allow EU fishing vessels, EU fisheries, to enter UK waters for 12 years. They have signed an extremely long-term agreement. And just to explain to our viewers, the ideal situation for the United Kingdom would be to have a one-year agreement or an annual agreement that would be reviewed on a 12-month basis. Why? Because that allows the United Kingdom to use fishing as a bargaining tool every year to renegotiate on a number of issues it wants to renegotiate. Now, it's offered this concession. So for 12 years, the agreement stands, and Britain does not have the option of using fisheries or the fishing sector as a bargaining tool for any of the other issues it wants to talk about. The other thing is the quotas. They will remain as they are for 12 years. Some representatives, for example, of the Scottish fishing industry are describing this as catastrophic because it means that they can't lower the quotas for 12 years. Obviously, it's a big win for the European Union because that was one of their absolute top priorities. So far, if we look at that particular issue, it looks like perhaps the UK has conceded more than the EU on this particular topic.
So, Karina, we've been speaking there a lot about fishing as a bargaining tool, but I just want to ask you, really, how beneficial is this for the European Union? And I just say that because we've seen Donald Trump put tariff pressure on many, many countries, and we know the UK has done a deal with the US. Are the European Union now looking to the UK where they can get trade and they can benefit from, because they don't know what's coming when it comes to US tariffs?
Absolutely. And as we know, and we chatted about this, the United Kingdom has already signed a deal with the United States. So perhaps on that front in particular, they're one step ahead of the EU. And again, that goes back to perhaps that is one of the reasons that motivated Ursula von der Leyen and all the European countries to come to the table and to sit down and to offer some concessions. And it's really important to say here that we talked about fisheries and the concession the UK offered. In return, what the UK is getting is essentially open access for its agriculture, its produce, essentially its food, and veterinary standards will be relaxed, allowing for British exports, food exports, to enter all of the European market unimpeded. No checks, no custom checks, etc. So that will greatly reduce the red tape and the bureaucracy. And what the government is saying, it's going to reduce prices for British consumers, but it's also going to reduce prices for European consumers because all that friction that was adding cost to businesses on both sides will be greatly reduced. So that's why we're saying it's a win-win. So for the British consumer, for the European consumer, we're talking about lower prices, potentially also lower inflation. And in terms of that sort of wider picture, it is in the European Union's interest to have a better frictionless relationship with one of its nearest neighbors with whom it's had this very close trading relationship over decades that has obviously suffered greatly. So on the food topic, for example, since Brexit, the volume of food exports from the United Kingdom to the EU has dropped 30%. That's a really big drop. Now, if the agreement is in fact implemented quickly, we're going to see a lot more trade from the UK to the EU, but also vice versa. And the youth mobility scheme is extremely important. Although it wasn't agreed in fine print, the parameters of it were announced today. That is something that the EU is also greatly asking for. The Erasmus University scheme, again, if we look at the figures in terms of mobility, at the end of the day, previous experience showed us that when you look at the numbers, there are historically been more European youth and students coming to the United Kingdom versus British people going to the European Union. And so that is also something that the EU has been really fighting for and one of their top priorities along with fisheries. So that again is another win, shall we say, for the EU. And when they're looking at the bigger picture and they're looking at all the challenges they're facing in terms of tariffs from the United States, etc., they're saying, you know what, we're going to look to the UK, we're going to improve our relationships with them because in the current situation, that's our best bet right now.
Karina, Camel, always great to have you on. Thank you so much for joining me. Israel has announced it will allow a limited amount of food aid into Gaza, easing a 10-week blockade that has pushed the territory to the brink of famine. The decision comes amid mounting international pressure and growing concerns over the humanitarian crisis, and after Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu reportedly warned that a full-blown starvation crisis could jeopardize Israel's renewed military offensive against Hamas. I'm now joined by our correspondent, Trent Murray, who is in Tel Aviv for us. Trent, thank you so much for joining us. So aid supplies have started going into Gaza today. We've had reports of that after this blockade that we have seen for over 3 months. What more can you tell us?
Yeah, Leigh-Ann, about 20 minutes ago, we got official confirmation here from COGAT, which is the official Israeli body that oversees Palestinian affairs, that the first of that aid has now entered the Gaza Strip. That would represent the first aid into the besieged strip since March 2nd. We're not being told exactly what it was, but earlier today we got some insight from the Foreign Ministry, who said that the first batches of aid are going to prioritise flour, baby food and medical supplies. Now, what we are not getting answers to questions around is just how much of this aid will enter and how quickly it will get there. All the Israelis are saying today is that over the coming days there will be dozens of aid trucks. Now, of course, we know this comes after almost 3 months of this blockade being implemented against a backdrop of criticism, concern about the welfare of people in Gaza. Estimates by the UN that around 500,000 people at risk of immediate starvation. And I think what you are seeing now is that some of that pressure that was being applied internationally is now starting to have an impact, certainly based on the timing of all of this, but also the statements from the government that they want to avoid, in their words, pictures of hunger being beamed out into the world from Gaza. So I think it's still way too early to make an assessment on just how effective this aid delivery will be. Certainly the need is quite great. It's a big job trying to get that aid out to the roughly 2.3 million people living in Gaza. But certainly I think for some of those aid groups, they will be satisfied, pleased somewhat that at least something's getting in. Again, the priorities being flour, baby food and medical supplies.
Yes, indeed, Trent. I'm sure some much needed relief for everyone. But Israel has also ramped up its offensive in Gaza. And we also heard from Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu earlier. What more did he have to say?
Yeah, the Prime Minister put up a fairly lengthy video kind of outlining the state of play when it comes to Israel's strategy here in the Gaza Strip. A lot of the focus was on the delivery of aid, and I think you got some insights into his thinking, because he has said in this video that even Israel's strongest supporters have told me that we can give the country weapons, support at the United Nations, help defeating Hamas, but one thing we cannot support is mass starvation. I think insight there that some of that pressure was becoming quite real, particularly from the United States. We've heard from the White House today saying that President Trump wants to see an end to this conflict as soon as possible. But while that language around the aid, I think, is certainly garnering a lot of the headlines, we do need to remember there is a major uptick in military operations in Gaza right now. It's Operation Gideon's Chariots, as the IDF is calling it, and we're seeing major evacuation orders issued, including for places like Khan Yunis, the second biggest city in Gaza in the south, where hundreds of thousands of people have been sheltering. Those warnings are coming with some quite serious language around unprecedented and imminent attacks coming from the IDF. So I think right now, the situation on the ground does remain quite tense. We certainly are seeing the airstrikes continue, as well as those ground operations. It will be a crucial few days for the Gaza Strip.
Trent Murray in Tel Aviv, thank you for joining us. Former US President Joe Biden has thanked well-wishers for their support after revealing he's been diagnosed with prostate cancer that has spread to his bones. According to a statement, the diagnosis was made on Friday after the 82-year-old saw a doctor last week for urinary symptoms. Biden, who left office in January, is now undergoing further evaluation and treatment planning. For more on this, I'm joined by oncologist and president of Atossa Therapeutics, Dr. Steven Quay. It's an absolute pleasure to have you on the show, Dr. Steven. Thank you for joining us. So I just said there, Joe...
Happy to be here.
Great to have you. Joe Biden has been diagnosed with an extremely aggressive form of prostate cancer. And it said that this was diagnosed recently. Why was this not diagnosed any earlier?
Well, I think, in medical school, they tell you when you hear hoofbeats, think of horses, not zebras. So there are some very rare cancers that could operate as fast as this did. But the 98% probability is that this was known at the time of his physical last July and wasn't revealed. It's simply not credible to have cancer be in your bones 13 months after having any sort of prostate examination. The prostate cancers that do not produce a PSA, which is the blood test, also are not hormone sensitive. So we're told that this cancer is hormone sensitive. So it rules out the 2% of cancers that wouldn't be detected by a blood test. So I think in all likelihood he is known that he has had prostate cancer for about a year. Now I've gone further, and I'm certainly speculating here, but the treatment for prostate cancer of this type is something called ADT, androgen deprivation therapy. And the two major side effects are cognitive decline and falling down. You lose skeletal muscle, and about 37% of all men will fall down during the first year of treatment there. So now I'm beginning to wonder whether perhaps he was under prostate cancer treatment in the last year, and some of the things we saw on camera were the side effects of that treatment.
Doctor, you've just basically answered the second question I was going to talk to you about, because Joe Biden's health has been under the spotlight and really intense scrutiny, especially his cognitive ability. So, as you said, do you think that this diagnosis could explain some of the former president's behavior that we have seen? And we also know he dropped out of that election race quite late on.
Yes, I think, and I'm being specific about the fact that the treatment for metastatic prostate cancer has side effects that include cognitive decline. It's not the cancer itself that would necessarily cause cognitive decline, but I suspect it was known that he had pretty advanced cancer. The treatment would have been put in place, and then some of the falling and some of the cognitive decline would be attributable to that. There could be multiple causes of the cognition even before the prostate cancer, but this level of metastatic disease is probably a 5 to 7 year process.
Potential treatment and next steps have been revealed. Hormone therapy has been suggested. How effective is this in helping what Joe Biden has been diagnosed with?
Yeah. So for your viewers who, many of the men will eventually have prostate cancer. It's the most common cancer in men. So the treatment for hormone-sensitive cancer is really good for 2 to 3 years, and it absolutely stops the disease from progressing. But Darwin sort of raises his head, and the tumor evolves to be independent of testosterone, and then it starts to grow again. The treatment no longer works. You're then in the chemotherapy zone, which is a little harsher, a lot harder to take. But, for an 82-year-old man, I think this will be part of his final chapter, but may not be the final endpoint.
And just for everyone watching and the men out there that you just said to yourself, how easy is it to diagnose prostate cancer?
Well, you can get into the high triage area very quickly. A blood test for something called PSA and a digital rectal exam to feel the prostate through the rectum. Those two tests will find 95% of all cancers. They will also find some inflammation or infections or just benign prostate enlargement. So you do have further diagnostic tests. But to end up with metastatic cancer in your bones, you usually see that in clinics where people don't have insurance and they show up in the emergency room. So that this is not a finding for a presidential, for a person who has been a president for 4 years, a vice president, a senator. It's just not credible that this wasn't known.
And King Charles has actually written to Joe Biden after his cancer diagnosis. And for you and yourself as a doctor, how important is it that such high-profile figures are discussing their personal journeys with cancer?
Well, I think it's a good. I mean, 40, 50 years ago, cancer wasn't mentioned. Sometimes you would talk to the relatives and not the patient about it. But we've come a very long way now, and I think men are a little more reluctant to talk about their health than women. So I think it is good. As I said, prostate cancer, lung cancer are the two major cancers in men, and prostate cancer is so treatable if you get it locally. 95, 97% 5-year survival if you catch it when it's in the prostate. But it goes from the prostate to around the prostate in the pelvis and then into the bone. So it's a two-step process. That's why this is so late for President Biden. But look, if you're 50, you should have a PSA test. And if you've had some family history of prostate cancer, maybe 45. And then you can track it over time.
Well, that's really a good news for everybody out there who's watching to take those steps, especially at that age. But I just want to clarify one final thing with you, Doctor. According to a statement, I'm just going to say it once again, the diagnosis was made on Friday after Joe Biden saw the doctor last week for urinary symptoms. But you do think that this is a surprise diagnosis and it was possibly known by the president even when he was in the White House?
Yes, again, for 98% of prostate cancers that are metastatic last week in the bones, they were easily diagnosed July of 2024, diagnosed in 23, 22, 2019. So, yes, it would be malpractice not to know that he had prostate cancer. That was progressing over the last 5 to 7 years. So, we all have medical privacy rights, I think, although maybe the president has some further obligations to be president of the United States. That's a political question.
Yeah, no, absolutely. But I just wanted to say thank you so much for joining us, oncologist and president of Atossa Therapeutics, Dr. Steven Quay. I much appreciate your time this evening. Thank you once again.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Let's take a look at the top business news now. Finance leaders from G7 countries are seeking unity on economic security, Ukraine, and artificial intelligence cooperation. According to experts, officials meeting this week in Canada will be looking to keep the powerful Western policy alliance from fracturing amid US tariff pressure. G7 members Japan, Germany, France, and Italy all face a potential doubling of US reciprocal taxes to 20% in July. Spain has ordered Airbnb to withdraw more than 65,000 listings for holiday rentals that violated existing rules from its platform. The Spanish government is targeting listings that lack license numbers or owner details. This is part of a general crackdown on a business blamed for contributing to the housing crisis in the country. Turning to all the sports news now, and Scottie Scheffler has collected his third major and his first PGA championship at Quail Hollow on Sunday, shooting a final round 71 to take home a 5-shot victory. Scheffler joined Tiger Woods and Jack Nicklaus as the only golfer to win 3 or more majors and 15 or more PGA Tour events by the age of 29. And Carlos Alcaraz has beaten Yannick Sinner to win the Rome Masters in straight sets. The Italian world number 1 suffered defeat in his final of his first tournament back after a drugs ban. The duo are expected to be 2 of the favourites to win at Roland Garros, with Alcaraz the defending champion. A reminder of our top stories. US President Donald Trump is speaking with Russian President Putin in a call aimed at ending what he's described as the bloodbath in Ukraine. Former US President Joe Biden has been diagnosed with prostate cancer that has spread to his bones. Israel has announced it will allow a limited amount of food aid into Gaza as its ground offensive intensifies. And that's all from us on W News. Don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel and also follow us on X. The rail deal is coming up next. Plus, we'll be back in just a couple of hours with W News Extra. Goodbye and thank you for joining us.